Hey readers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire Books. I feel like I've been neglecting my channel and I'm so sorry, but here I am with a roundup of what I read in January and February. Just because the filming stops, that does not mean the reading does. I've read about 16 books so far this year, and that's actually felt a little slow. I think I'll be speeding it up in March. So I started off the year on a very high note. I read Intimacies by Kitamura. This is a great book. It is about a woman who is a translator at The Hague, and just as she kind of gets caught between languages and sometimes feels like she's not really there because she's interpreting and essentially existing for someone else as opposed to being a separate person with interpretations in her own right, she's also kind of lost in her own life. So she negotiates a new love interest, and she also deals with communicating for war criminals in this same kind of liminal space where, you know, she's old enough to have a career, she's not a baby anymore, but she still feels lost. And I actually, as a woman in my mid-30s, identify with that a lot. I thought it was a really good book. It was very restrained in its writing style, and I thought it was very beautiful. I liked it. Definitely try it out if that premise sounds interesting to you. The next book I read, I actually just read this because it was linked on Reddit and I was really curious. I really enjoy reading Am I the Asshole threads, and somebody put a link to Why Does He Do That by Lundy, Bancroft. This is basically a book about a therapist who works with abusive men and wants to know why they are that way and how their behavior can be helped, or if that's even possible. It was super interesting. It didn't necessarily tell me anything that I didn't know or that was super surprising, but it was really interesting to see what we know about abusers put in a really organized way. After that, I read the very salacious Sex with Kings by Eleanor Herman. This is a book about the mistresses of royalty in Europe, and it was fascinating. So you would think that, you know, being a mistress, like, ooh, sex, scandal, and yeah, that's all there. But what was really interesting was that this book really gets into some of the details of the mistresses' lives. Like, probably the most poignant anecdote that's going to stick with me is that there was a mistress who was on this day-long carriage ride with the king, and she couldn't stop to ask for a bathroom break because mistresses aren't supposed to, you know, pee, and they're not supposed to be uncomfortable. They're always supposed to be happy all the time to please the king. And so by the time they got to their destination, she was so desperate that she ran into a chapel and peed in one of the sacred cups. And like, it's so gross. But it was really interesting to read about sort of the more murky realities of the mistresses' lives. How much their career, so to speak, depended on keeping the king happy, how they could be easily supplanted by rivals, what mistresses who lasted a long time did differently from those who didn't. It was super interesting, actually. And if you can stand a little bit of sauciness in your reading, I really recommend this one. It was fascinating. After that, I read Alternative Universities by David Staley. This is just sort of an interesting book about potential futures of higher education. You know, I'm a high school teacher. I think a lot about academia as a post-ac person, so I like to read thoughts about where the university could go. And this book provided. It was basically a collection of theoretical models of how non-traditional universities could work in the future. I didn't think all of them were great, but that's not really the point. I think the idea is to think about what could happen and then maybe come up with more interesting solutions for future educational settings. If you're into that sort of thing, this book gave a lot of food for thought. If not, it's pretty niche. After that, I read two books by Paul Strathern. The first was the Medicis, the second was the Borgias. And basically, I just wanted to read about two big famous families from Europe that were full of skullduggery and drama, and I got exactly what I wanted. Both of these were super interesting reads. I feel like I got a really good grounding in Europe at the time when these families were at the height of their power. And I got a bit of a sense of who these people were as people, which is what I really, really like about history. So I feel like I picked up a lot of good information, and I definitely use it as a primer for some of the future reading I did in the month, as you will see shortly. Before we get to that, however, I read Beautiful Country by Wang, and it was really, really good. It is the memoir of a little girl whose parents bring her to America. They are illegal immigrants from China, and she grows up in tremendous poverty and under a lot of stress and undergoes a lot of trauma. But at the same time, she becomes a little girl who loves books, someone who's really curious about the world, a dutiful daughter who adores her parents, and, you know, she's now grown into a tremendous writer and a very highly educated woman. So if you want to kind of read somebody who succeeded, but they're taking a perspective on their childhood when none of that was guaranteed. This book is really interesting. And I feel like reading the stories and experiences of immigrants who come to the United States is something we should all be doing right now. And Wang is a great author for that, because she's so real about her childhood self, but she's also tender towards that self. And I thought it was really beautiful. Beautiful country. We may not be that to everybody, but she is a beautiful writer. Next, I read The Rival Queens by Nancy Goldstone, and this was about Catherine de' Medici and her daughter, Marguerite de Valois. And this was such a cool story. It really goes well beyond just a mother-daughter relationship and into the larger political and religious issues of the time, but that's what made this book so fascinating. It was just such a cool, insightful look at the wars of religion in Europe, at the conflict between Protestants and Catholics, at strong women trying to make their way and exert power in a world that didn't always respect them. This book has it all. And what I really like about Goldstone's writing is that I feel like she really does a good job of presenting historical figures with foibles and as real people, while also giving a really good perspective on what exactly was happening and the consequences of what everybody was doing for world history. So it's history, it's learning about human beings, it's everything that I really like in a good bit of nonfiction. So I'm actually planning to keep reading a bunch of her books. I actually read another one of hers as my last book of February, and we'll get to that momentarily. But I also like this because I read Paul Strathern's book about the Medicis, so I had a better understanding of Catherine de' Medici and where she was coming from by the time I got to this book. So I'm like reading enough European history where things start to reinforce each other, and I really like when that happens. After that, I read The Family by Naomi Krupitsky. I didn't think this was that great. It was a Book of the Month Club pick, and it's about two women who are born into mob families, essentially, and they grow up and make their own decisions about romance and freedom and whether they want to be like their parents. And I mean, it was okay. It was not as mob drama as I wanted it to be or how it was advertised, and the ending did not make a ton of sense to me. So, I mean, it was entertaining enough, but it was nothing amazing. It was certainly no Godfather, despite the font on the book cover. After that, I went on a little bit of a binge. I read the first 4 volumes of Attack on Titan. You know, my students talk about manga all the time. I've been enjoying a lot of visual novels on my Nintendo Switch, and I thought it might be kind of fun to read some manga. And so I did, and it was like eating potato chips, but the book version. And I'm definitely going to go back for more. Attack on Titan has been super interesting so far. If you've not read it, it's basically about a world where humans live inside this walled enclosure to keep out creatures called Titans who eat humans mercilessly and are very large and powerful. And, what is humanity going to do? So with that premise, Attack on Titan begins, and it's been pretty fun so far. I'm going to keep going on that ride for a little while. It was also really fun to be able to talk about it with my students, because I feel like they like it when you're reading something that they're reading, and I just like that they're reading. So anything that reinforces that is great in my book. After that, I read Vladimir by Julia May Jonas. Ooh, I had mixed feelings about this one. This book was interesting. There were parts of it that I really, really liked, and then there were parts that I thought did not work as well as I was hoping they would. The basic premise of the book is that it's kind of about the Me Too movement. There's this aging professor, she's in her late 50s. The head of the department that she's married to has just gotten Me Too'd. So he had slept around with students who were of age, but still students in the past. And now there are petitions to have him removed from his position at the university. She is kind of wrapped up in it because on the one hand, she thinks that everybody is a whiner and that, her husband didn't do anything wrong. On the other, she's also kind of tired of his crap. In the midst of all of this, she develops an infatuation with a younger English professor who's new to campus. And so her infatuation with him kind of makes her rethink who she is and who she wants to be. And, they have a relationship such as it is. I'm not going to divulge too many details about that. What I will say is that the Me Too parts of this book were actually amazing. I thought that the author did a really good job of kind of adopting the viewpoint of an older liberal woman who's used to feeling like she's on the right side of history, and then putting her up against forces that maybe she doesn't agree with and that show that she's aging and that the culture of young people now is not the same as the culture that she's in. So she has felt empowered before. Now she maybe feels like she's going to be replaced in multiple ways because, you know, she might be on the way out of this university. And you know, all of those feelings and her musings about that I thought were really, really good. Not because they draw any kind of conclusion, but because they set up emotional tensions that I think that a lot of us feel, including within ourselves, but that are hard to express. But you can express them through the mind of an older professor woman. And, you know, also the parts where she doesn't really understand what the right thing to do is. Like, there's some really notable moments where she absolutely screws up her relationships with students because she isn't hearing them. And, you know, watching her do that was super interesting. It was informative for me as a teacher because it makes me think about listening to my students enough. But it also, I think, did a good job of touching our cultural fault lines in academia among liberal intellectuals right now. I actually thought that the Vladimir infatuation part was the least interesting part of the book. I mean, it's really not as hot as I wanted it to be, and what it was just not anything I wanted it to be either. It's actually where the book got weird, and I kind of quit being entranced by what this professor was doing and thinking, and more just kind of grossed out. So I had mixed feelings about this one. There were things about it that I thought were really spot on, and then other places where I thought that the writing dropped the ball because it didn't keep me entranced the way I would have liked. But it was interesting. If you like academic thriller type work, or you like to read about professors and their ways, then this book might be a good one for you. After that, I read The Latinist by Mark Prins. This is another book that I think could have been amazing, but it also fell short in some really key ways. I'm actually going to release a full video review of this one in a few days because I thought it was worth talking about it at length. But it's another kind of dark academia book where in this one, there's a woman who is about to finish her PhD. She's on the job market. She hasn't heard anything back. She's getting really scared. And she receives an email that tells her that maybe she should not be trusting the recommendation letters from her advisor who has shepherded her career and who she trusted. And the horror of being trapped like that really does come out of the book. But there are also some major flaws in it that I will discuss in a separate video. So once I've published that, I'm actually going to put it in the show notes here so you can check that out. And then today, my last book of February, I read another Nancy Goldstone. This one was In the Shadow of the Empress. It's about Maria Theresa of Austria and her daughters. Her other children also come into play, but it's really mostly about her daughters, who all lived fascinating lives, some of which ended horribly. One of her daughters was Marie Antoinette, and some of which ended, you know, in ways that were stressful or on kind of weird notes. But each of these women lived a really powerful life and did something really interesting in their world. And getting to know them as people, which I think is just a hallmark of Nancy Goldstone's work, I've noticed it multiple times now, felt really good. It made me really identify with them and care about what they were going through. I did not understand a lot about the French royal family, I now realize, until I read this book and learned about Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette and their relationship. And I mean, I'm still about freedom and liberty, but I also feel really bad for how their lives ended, given the effort that they were putting in to try to fix things. So it was really interesting. I do love a book that can humanize people who are from the distant past. It made me feel like I had a much better grasp on this time period. I learned a little bit about Napoleon again, whose biography I read in the end of 2021. And so again, like I've just kind of been on this kick where I'm reinforcing what I know by adding more knowledge that connects to what I've been learning in my nonfiction reading. And I find that super satisfying. So that was my January and February. I am going to be going on like a little retreat later this month where I will basically read and nap for an entire weekend. So I'm hoping that March I'm going to post some good reading numbers because that's what I want to be doing. But for now, I've had a great couple months of reading. Please leave me a comment if you read anything worth talking about or want to know about something that I read. Please do like and subscribe. And most of all, happy reading.